The sound of china shattering against hardwood floors still echoes in my mind, even though it happened 3 months ago. I can still see Margaret's face, pale as winter snow, staring at that crumpled bank statement in her trembling hands. For 15 years, she had looked at me like I was something she'd scrape off her designer shoes. For 15 years, she'd made sure I knew exactly how worthless she thought I was. But in that moment, watching her world crumble around her perfectly manicured feet, I finally understood what real power felt like. I had spent so many years believing her lies about my worth that I'd forgotten who I really was underneath all that pain. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very woman who tried to destroy my self-worth was now begging for my help. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let me take you back to where this all began, because this story isn't just about revenge or money or even justice. It's about finding your voice when everyone around you has spent years convincing you that you don't deserve to speak. My name is Sarah, and I'm married into what I thought was the American dream. Picture-perfect suburban house in Connecticut, white picket fence, 2-car garage, and a husband who seemed to have stepped right out of a Ralph Lauren catalog. David Mitchell was everything a small-town girl from Ohio could have dreamed of when I met him during my junior year at Northwestern. He was studying law, I was working on my MBA, and we had these long conversations about building something meaningful together. His family had old money, the kind that came with country club memberships and summer houses in the Hamptons. Mine had calloused hands and coupon clipping Sunday afternoons. When David first brought me home for Thanksgiving in 2008, I was so nervous I could barely keep my sweet potato casserole from sliding off the serving tray. His mother, Margaret Mitchell, greeted me at their massive colonial front door wearing pearls and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She looked me up and down like she was appraising livestock at a county fair, and I knew right then that I had already failed some test I didn't even know I was taking. That first dinner was a masterclass in subtle warfare that I wouldn't fully understand until years later. Margaret had this way of asking questions that sounded polite on the surface, but cut deep underneath. "Oh, Sarah, your dress is so unique. Did you find it at one of those discount stores?" she'd ask with that perfectly practiced concerned tone. When I mentioned my father worked construction, she'd tilt her head sympathetically and say, "How noble of him to work with his hands." Not everyone can be blessed with intellectual gifts. Every compliment came wrapped in barbed wire, every smile felt like a warning. David's father, Richard, was quieter but no less intimidating in his own way. He'd grunt acknowledgments when I spoke and return to his Wall Street Journal like I was furniture that had momentarily made noise. The worst part wasn't their obvious disapproval, though. The worst part was how David seemed to shrink in their presence, becoming this apologetic version of himself that I'd never seen before. He'd give me these pleading looks across the dinner table, silently begging me to just endure it, to not rock the boat he'd been carefully balancing in his whole life. The pattern established itself quickly after David, and I got engaged in 2009. Margaret would invite us to family gatherings where I'd be introduced as David's little friend from Ohio, even though we'd been together for 2 years by then. She'd seat me at the far end of the table during dinner parties, away from the interesting conversation. When we announced our engagement, her first words weren't congratulations, but concern about whether I understood the responsibilities that come with being part of a family like ours. She insisted on planning our entire wedding, claiming she knew what would be appropriate for someone of David's standing. Every decision I tried to make was gently but firmly overruled. My choice of flowers wasn't sophisticated enough, my preferred venue wasn't prestigious enough, even my wedding dress needed to be replaced with something more suitable. I watched my dream wedding transform into Margaret's vision of what a proper Mitchell family wedding should look like. David assured me it was just easier to let her handle everything, that it didn't really matter as long as we ended up married. But it did matter, because with every choice she made for me, she was sending a clear message about my place in this family. The early years of our marriage were a careful dance around Margaret's expectations and manipulations. She had this way of dropping by our apartment unannounced, always finding something wrong with how I was keeping house, or cooking, or decorating. "Oh, Sarah, you've hung the curtains crooked again," she'd say, already moving to fix them herself. "David is used to a certain standard, you know." She'd rearrange my kitchen cabinets because efficiency matters when you're hosting important people, then spend the next hour explaining why my organizational system was all wrong. When I got my first job at a marketing firm after graduation, she'd make little comments about how cute it was that I was playing career woman, as if my work was some sort of adorable hobby. She never missed an opportunity to remind me that David's trust fund meant I didn't really need to work, that perhaps I should focus on more important things like learning to be a proper hostess. The gaslighting was so subtle and consistent that I started to question my own perceptions. Maybe I really was disorganized. Maybe my cooking wasn't good enough. Maybe I was being too sensitive about her helpful suggestions. The breaking point began to build during our 5th year of marriage when David and I started trying to have children. Margaret immediately inserted herself into this deeply personal aspect of our lives, recommending fertility specialists and suggesting I might need to change my diet, my exercise routine, my entire lifestyle. When month after month passed without a pregnancy, her comments became more pointed. Perhaps if Sarah spent less time at that job and more time taking care of herself, she'd suggest to David when she thought I couldn't hear. Some women just aren't naturally maternal, you know. The implication was always there, hanging in the air like smoke. I wasn't good enough to carry the Mitchell family legacy forward. When we finally did get pregnant after 2 years of trying, Margaret's first reaction wasn't joy, but a list of rules about prenatal vitamins, exercise restrictions, and dietary requirements. She had already picked out nursery themes and baby names, assuming control over yet another aspect of my life. But then I miscarried at 12 weeks, and something inside me finally started to crack. As I lay in that hospital bed, processing our loss, Margaret's first words to me weren't comfort or sympathy. They were concerned about how this setback might affect David's emotional well-being and whether I'd be strong enough to try again properly next time. After the miscarriage, something fundamental shifted in our family dynamic, though it would take me years to fully understand what was happening. Margaret's behavior became more aggressive, more pointed, as if my inability to carry a pregnancy to term had confirmed every doubt she'd ever had about my worthiness. She started making comments about how some bloodlines are just stronger than others and how nature has a way of selecting what's meant to survive. The cruelty was breathtaking, but she delivered it with such clinical detachment that David would later claim I was being overly sensitive or reading too much into innocent observations. She began hosting family dinners where she'd invite David's ex-girlfriends, particularly his college girlfriend Amanda, who had married a successful surgeon and had 3 beautiful children. Margaret would spend entire evenings praising Amanda's mothering skills, her decorating choices, her husband's achievements, all while shooting meaningful glances in my direction. The message was crystal clear. This is what David should have ended up with. This is what a proper Mitchell wife looks like. David would sit there, uncomfortable but silent, occasionally squeezing my hand under the table but never actually defending me or telling his mother to stop. The psychological warfare escalated during holidays and family gatherings, where Margaret had a captive audience for her performance. Christmas of 2015 was particularly brutal. She had prepared elaborate stockings for everyone in the family, including David's cousin's children, but somehow forgot to make one for me. When I quietly mentioned it, she gasped and covered her mouth in mock horror, claiming she'd been so focused on the real family members that it had slipped her mind. She rushed to create a makeshift stocking from a kitchen towel, apologizing profusely while making sure everyone witnessed her mistake. The humiliation was devastating, but the way she played it off as an innocent oversight was masterful. Later that evening, I overheard her telling David's aunt that she worried about my stability and whether I was the kind of person who could handle the pressures of being a Mitchell. She painted herself as the concerned mother-in-law, worried about her son's happiness, while systematically destroying my reputation within the family. Every family member began treating me with a mixture of pity and suspicion, as if I were some fragile thing that might shatter at any moment. Margaret's control extended far beyond family gatherings into every aspect of our daily lives. She had somehow convinced David that she should have keys to our house for emergencies, which meant she could and would show up whenever she pleased. I'd come home from work to find her reorganizing my closets or redecorating our living room, always with some excuse about wanting to help or surprise us. She'd go through our mail, commenting on our spending habits and suggesting ways we could be more responsible with money. When I tried to set boundaries, she'd turn on the waterworks, claiming I was being hostile and ungrateful for all her help. David, caught between his wife and his mother, would inevitably side with her, explaining that she meant well and that I should try to be more understanding. The gaslighting was so complete that I began to question my own sanity. Maybe I was being ungrateful. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe she really was just trying to help and I was the problem. This doubt ate away at my confidence until I found myself apologizing for things that weren't my fault and accepting treatment that no human being should have to endure. The financial manipulation began subtly but grew more obvious over time. Margaret would make comments about how expensive our lifestyle was, how David was wasting his inheritance on our modest 3-bedroom house instead of investing in something more substantial. She'd suggest that I was holding him back financially, that my student loans were a burden on the family's resources. When David received his annual trust fund distribution, she'd somehow always have a family emergency or investment opportunity that required his immediate attention and money. She convinced him to co-sign on her various business ventures, always with the promise that she'd pay him back with interest. But the repayment never came, and when I'd bring it up, she'd act hurt and confused, claiming she thought it was a gift between family members. Over the years, hundreds of thousands of dollars flowed from our accounts to hers, always with elaborate explanations about tax benefits or investment opportunities that never materialized. When I tried to track the money or suggest we needed better documentation, Margaret would accuse me of not trusting family and David would lecture me about the importance of loyalty and generosity. My attempts to fight back or establish independence were met with increasingly sophisticated manipulation tactics. When I suggested we spend Thanksgiving with my family in Ohio for once, Margaret developed a mysterious illness that required David's immediate presence. When I started making friends with other women in our neighborhood, she'd somehow arrange social events that conflicted with my plans, always with some urgent family obligation that required my attention. She had this uncanny ability to manufacture crises whenever I tried to establish my own identity or relationships outside of her control. The most insidious part was how she positioned herself as the victim in every scenario. If I tried to have a private conversation with David about his mother's behavior, she'd somehow find out and confront me with tears in her eyes, claiming she'd only ever tried to welcome me into the family. She'd rewrite history in real time, denying conversations that had happened just days before, making me question my own memory and perception of events. David, witnessing his mother's distress, would assume I was the aggressor and rush to comfort her, leaving me feeling isolated and crazy. The breaking point came during the summer of 2018 when Margaret announced that she'd be moving in with us temporarily while her house was being renovated. What was supposed to be a 2-week stay stretched into 6 months of pure hell. She took over our guest room and immediately began rearranging our entire house to suit her preferences. She'd wake up early and start cleaning, making pointed comments about how I wasn't maintaining the house properly. She'd cook elaborate meals that David loved, but that I couldn't eat due to my allergies, then act concerned about my finicky eating habits when I'd make myself a simple sandwich instead. She'd invite her friends over without asking, treating our home like her personal social club. When I complained to David, she'd overhear and burst into tears, claiming she felt unwelcome and like a burden, wondering aloud if she should just move into a hotel instead. David would panic at the thought of his mother feeling rejected and would beg both of us to find a way to make it work. The constant tension was destroying our marriage, but Margaret seemed energized by the chaos, as if she thrived on the drama and conflict she was creating. By the time she finally moved back to her own house, I was a shadow of my former self, anxious, depressed, and completely isolated from any support system I might have had. The moment that changed everything happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in October 2019, when I was sitting in my car outside David's office building, waiting to surprise him for lunch. I had been working on rebuilding myself after Margaret's 6-month invasion, trying to remember who I used to be before 15 years of systematic emotional demolition. I'd started seeing a therapist, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had been helping me understand that what I'd been experiencing wasn't normal family dynamics, but textbook psychological abuse. For the first time in years, I was beginning to trust my own perceptions again, to believe that my feelings were valid and my experiences were real. That afternoon, I watched through the rain-streaked windshield as David walked out of his building, not alone, but with Margaret. They were deep in conversation, and something about their body language made me stay in the car instead of getting out to greet them. I watched as they sat on a bench under the building's awning, Margaret's hand on David's arm, her face animated with what looked like urgent concern. I couldn't hear their words, but I could read their expressions, and what I saw made my blood run cold. I sat there for 20 minutes, watching my husband and his mother having what was clearly an intimate, secretive conversation about something that involved me. Margaret kept glancing around as if checking to make sure they weren't being observed, while David nodded grimly at whatever she was telling him. When she pulled out a manila folder and handed it to him, my heart started racing. David opened it, examined the contents, and his face went pale. He looked up at his mother with an expression I'd never seen before, part shock, part anger, part something that looked almost like fear. Margaret was talking rapidly now, gesturing emphatically, and I could see her lips forming my name. Whatever was in that folder, it was about me, and David's reaction told me it wasn't good. When they finally parted ways, Margaret looked satisfied, almost triumphant, while David looked like he'd been hit by a truck. He stood there for several minutes after she left, staring at the folder in his hands, before finally walking back toward his office building. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. That evening, David came home acting strange, distant in a way that felt different from his usual conflict avoidance. He kept looking at me when he thought I wasn't watching, studying my face like he was seeing me for the first time. When I asked about his day, he gave vague, non-committal answers, but I could feel the weight of unspoken questions hanging between us. During dinner, he barely ate, pushing food around his plate while stealing glances at me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "David, what's wrong? You're acting like I've grown a second head." He looked startled, then guilty, then defensive. "Nothing's wrong, Sarah. I'm just tired." But his voice had that careful, measured tone he used when he was lying, and we both knew it. I pressed him, asking about his lunch, about why he seemed so distracted, about whether his mother had said something to upset him. Each question made him more agitated, more evasive, until finally he exploded. Can't you just leave it alone? Not everything is about you or my mother. Sometimes people are just tired. The outburst was so unlike him that it confirmed my worst suspicions. Margaret had gotten to him with something, some lie or manipulation that was designed to drive a wedge between us. The next few days were torture. David withdrew completely, speaking to me only when necessary, spending long hours at work or locked in his home office. When I tried to initiate conversations, he'd find excuses to leave the room. When I suggested we talk about whatever was bothering him, he'd insist everything was fine while his body language screamed the opposite. Margaret, meanwhile, seemed to sense blood in the water. She started calling more frequently, always with some urgent matter that required David's immediate attention. She'd show up at our house unannounced, bringing David his favorite foods or small gifts, playing the role of the devoted mother while shooting me looks of pure satisfaction. It was clear that whatever she'd shown him in that folder was working exactly as she'd planned. The worst part was watching David struggle with whatever he thought he knew about me. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the way he'd start to reach for me then pull back, the way he'd begin to say something then stop himself. He was torn between 15 years of marriage and whatever poison his mother had fed him, and I could see that the poison was winning. A week after the mysterious meeting, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being a victim, done allowing Margaret to control the narrative of my life, done accepting David's cowardice in the face of his mother's manipulation. If she wanted to play dirty, I would show her what dirty really looked like. I had been keeping quiet about my own secrets for 15 years, allowing her to believe she held all the cards, but the truth was that I had been protecting everyone in that family from information that would destroy them. My silence hadn't been weakness, it had been mercy. But mercy was a luxury I could no longer afford. I called Dr. Walsh and scheduled an emergency session, not because I needed therapy, but because I needed a witness. I was about to stop playing defense and start playing offense, and I wanted someone to document my mental state before I went to war. That afternoon, sitting in her office, I told her everything, not just about Margaret's abuse, but about the secrets I'd been keeping, the information I'd been sitting on, the nuclear option I'd never wanted to use. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very quality Margaret had always criticized, my lack of breeding, was actually what had kept her family's reputation intact for over a decade. Growing up poor had taught me how to research, how to investigate, how to protect myself when the people around me couldn't be trusted. I had been quietly documenting Margaret's behavior for years, not out of vindictiveness, but out of self-preservation. I had bank records showing the money she'd borrowed from David. I had recordings of her most vicious attacks, made on my phone when I'd started to doubt my own sanity. I had photographs of the damage she'd done to our house during her helpful visits. I had medical records documenting the stress-related health issues I developed. But more importantly, I had information about Margaret's own secrets, things she'd assumed a simple girl from Ohio would never think to investigate. I knew about her hidden debts, her failed investments, her desperate financial situation that she'd been hiding from everyone, including David. I knew about the real reason she needed David's money so badly, and I knew that she was about to lose everything unless she could maintain control over her son's resources. As I sat in Dr. Walsh's office that day, laying out my evidence like a lawyer preparing for trial, I realized that Margaret Mitchell had made one critical error in her campaign against me. She had underestimated exactly who she was dealing with. The confrontation I'd been preparing for came sooner than expected, and it wasn't at all how I'd imagined it would unfold. 3 days after my session with Dr. Walsh, David finally worked up the courage to confront me with whatever Margaret had told him. It was a Saturday morning, and I was in the kitchen making coffee when he walked in holding that same manila folder I'd seen outside his office. His face was pale but determined, like a man about to perform an unpleasant but necessary duty. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "My mother showed me some things about you, about your past, and I need to know if they're true." My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady as I asked him what exactly his mother had told him. He opened the folder with trembling hands and pulled out what looked like financial documents and photographs. "She hired a private investigator," he said, unable to meet my eyes. "She found out about your family's bankruptcy when you were in college, about the lies you told me about your background, about the debt you were hiding when we got married." I stared at him in disbelief, not because the information was shocking, but because it was so pathetically inadequate as ammunition against me. I started laughing, which clearly wasn't the reaction David had expected. Here I was, preparing for nuclear warfare, and Margaret had brought a water pistol to the battlefield. "Is that it?" I asked, wiping tears of laughter from my eyes. "Your mother spent thousands of dollars on a private investigator to discover that my family went through financial hardship when I was 19? That I was embarrassed about being poor and didn't want to burden you with the details of my family's struggles." David looked confused and defensive, clearly thrown off by my reaction. "You lied to me, Sarah. For 15 years, you've been lying about who you really are." The accusation hung in the air between us, and I realized this was the moment of truth. I could continue to play the victim, continue to let Margaret control the narrative, or I could finally show them both who they were really dealing with. I walked to our home office, pulled out a thick folder from my locked filing cabinet, and returned to the kitchen. "You want to know who I really am, David? Let me show you." I dumped the contents of my folder across the kitchen table, watching his eyes widen as he took in the scope of what I'd been quietly collecting for over a decade. The bank statements were the first thing to catch his attention. Not mine, his mother's. Page after page of financial records showing Margaret's desperate situation, her mounting debts, her failed investments, her systematic theft from David's trust fund. "Your mother isn't the wealthy, sophisticated woman she pretends to be," I said calmly, watching the color drain from his face. "She's been living on credit and your money for years. That house renovation that lasted 6 months? It was actually a foreclosure proceeding that she managed to stall. Those business investments she kept asking you to fund? They were payments to creditors to keep them from taking her to court." I spread out more documents, loan applications where she'd forged David's signature, credit card statements showing gambling debts, correspondence from collection agencies threatening legal action. David picked up each document with shaking hands, his face growing paler with each revelation. "She's been using you as her personal ATM, David, and when I started asking questions about where all our money was going, she decided I was a threat that needed to be eliminated." But the financial records were just the beginning. I pulled out my phone and started playing audio recordings, Margaret's voice, clear as day, saying things that would have destroyed her reputation if they'd ever been made public. Her referring to David as weak and easily manipulated, her laughing about how that pathetic wife of his believed every lie she told, her strategizing with her friends about how to drive me to a nervous breakdown. David's face went from pale to ashen as he heard his beloved mother's true voice, the mask finally stripped away. "She's been playing us against each other for 15 years, I continued, pulling out photographs of damage she'd done to our house during her helpful visits, medical records documenting my stress-related health issues, and a detailed timeline of her manipulation tactics that read like a psychology textbook on emotional abuse. The only lies in this marriage, David, were the ones your mother told you about me. And the biggest lie of all was that she ever loved you more than she loved your bank account. The final piece of evidence was the one that shattered everything. I had discovered Margaret's secret through my own investigation. She had been embezzling money from the charity foundation she chaired, using her position to funnel donations into her personal accounts. I had traced nearly $200,000 in stolen funds, documented through bank transfers and false invoices that she'd been too arrogant to hide properly. Your mother isn't just a manipulative narcissist, David. She's a criminal. And she's been using our marriage as a cover for her activities, knowing that as long as she could control you, she could control the flow of money she needed to keep her scheme afloat. David collapsed into a chair, the weight of 15 years of lies finally crushing down on him. For the first time in our entire marriage, he was seeing his mother clearly, without the filter of his childhood conditioning and her masterful manipulation. The silence stretched between us as he processed the magnitude of what he was learning, not just about his mother, but about the wife he'd allowed to be systematically destroyed by the woman he'd trusted most. The sound of the front door opening interrupted our confrontation, and Margaret's voice called out cheerfully, "Hello, darlings. I brought lunch." She walked into the kitchen carrying bags from David's favorite deli, her face bright with false cheer that died the moment she saw the documents spread across our table. Her eyes darted from the bank statements to the recordings to David's devastated face, and I watched as 15 years of careful mask-wearing crumbled in an instant. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp with panic. "David, what has she done to you?" But David wasn't looking at her with his usual devotion anymore. He was looking at her like she was a stranger, someone he'd never really known at all. "Mother," he said quietly, his voice hollow with betrayal. "Is it true? All of this?" Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, her usual silver tongue finally failing her. She tried to rally, to spin some new story that would explain everything away, but for the first time in 15 years, her son wasn't listening to her lies. That's when Margaret made her final, desperate play. She collapsed into tears, clutching her chest dramatically and gasping about her heart, about the stress of being attacked by an ungrateful daughter-in-law, about how shocked she was that David would believe that woman over his own mother. It was a performance worthy of Broadway, complete with trembling hands and broken sobs about how much she'd sacrificed for her son's happiness. But I was ready for this too. I pulled out my phone and started recording as she threw her tantrum, capturing every manipulative word for posterity. "Are you really going to try the victim act one more time, Margaret?" I asked calmly. "After everything David just learned about you?" She looked at me with pure hatred then, all pretense finally abandoned, and I saw the real woman underneath all those years of fake smiles and passive-aggressive warfare. "You think you've won something?" she snarled. "You're nothing but white trash from Ohio, and no amount of money or evidence will ever change that." The irony was delicious. She was revealing her true nature while being recorded, providing me with even more evidence of her toxic character. But the most beautiful moment came when David finally found his voice. "Get out," he said quietly, but with absolute finality. "Get out of our house, get out of our lives, and don't ever contact us again unless it's through a lawyer." Margaret stared at him in shock, clearly never having imagined that her carefully controlled son would ever turn against her. She tried one last manipulation, reaching for him with trembling hands and whispering about how much she loved him, how everything she'd done was for his own good. But David stepped away from her touch like it burned him. "You destroyed my marriage, stole my money, and lied to me for 15 years, he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "That's not love, Mother. That's something sick and twisted that I won't allow in my life anymore." As she realized that her power over him was truly broken, Margaret's mask slipped completely, and she began screaming threats about disinheritance, about ruining our reputations, about making us pay for our ingratitude. But her threats rang hollow now that we knew the truth about her financial situation. She had no inheritance to withhold, no social standing to destroy us with, no power left except the illusion she'd been maintaining through smoke and mirrors. 6 months later, as I sit in our beautifully quiet house, I can finally breathe freely for the first time in 15 years. Margaret is facing criminal charges for the embezzlement, and David is working with prosecutors to help them build their case. Our marriage, surprisingly, survived the revelation of truth. David has been in intensive therapy, working to understand how he became so controlled by his mother's manipulation, and he's been making amends for all the years he failed to protect me from her abuse. We're rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of honesty instead of the quicksand of Margaret's lies. The most satisfying part isn't the revenge, though I won't lie and say it doesn't feel good to watch Margaret's carefully constructed world crumble around her. The most satisfying part is reclaiming my own identity, remembering who I was before 15 years of systematic degradation convinced me I was worthless. I was never the weak, pathetic woman Margaret wanted me to believe I was. I was strong enough to endure her abuse, smart enough to document it, and brave enough to finally fight back when I'd had enough. To anyone out there who's living with a Margaret of their own, let me tell you this: you are not crazy. You are not too sensitive, and you are not alone. Trust your instincts, document everything, and remember that bullies only have power as long as their victims stay silent. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's simply refusing to let someone else's toxicity define your worth anymore.